All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most notorious celebrations, the medieval Feast of Fools. But what if the whole story you think you know is just that, a story? So listen to this. This description comes from an absolutely scathing letter written back in 1445 by some very unhappy theologians at the University of Paris. It paints this picture of total chaos right inside the church. We're talking priests singing wanton songs, playing dice on the altar, just running completely wild. And for centuries, this one letter has been Exhibit A for the so-called debauchery of the Feast of Fools. And that right there is the big question we're tackling. Was this festival really a moment where, as one scholar famously put it, the natural lout beneath the cassock was just let loose? Or is this whole scandalous picture we have in our heads a carefully constructed myth? Well, we're about to find out. So if that wild, chaotic image isn't the whole truth, then where in the world did it come from? Who were the architects behind this whole legend? Well, it turns out our modern idea of the feast rests heavily on two key sources. First, you've got that letter from the Paris theologians we just talked about, a letter that was, pretty politically motivated and designed to get the feast shut down. And then, much later, you have the work of a 20th century scholar, E.K. Chambers. His book became the go-to source, and it basically collected and amplified all the most shocking accounts he could find. Yeah, see, Chambers' own methods are what really created this distorted picture. He completely ripped the feast out of its religious context. Then, and this is the big one, he gathered every single complaint and scandalous story from several centuries and just mashed them all together. It created this illusion that total chaos was happening everywhere, all the time. By focusing almost entirely on the people who hated the feast, he cemented this idea of it as nothing more than an ebullition of the natural lout beneath the cassock. So, what was it actually like? What was the historical reality of the Feast of Fools for most of the time it existed? Well, the truth is a lot more complex and, frankly, a lot more interesting. This timeline tells a totally different story. Instead of some ancient pagan thing the church was always fighting against, the Feast of Fools only shows up in the late 12th century. And get this, for more than 150 years, it actually had widespread support from within the church. It wasn't an outlaw festival. For a really long time, it was just an accepted part of the Christmas season festivities. And here's the crucial point. Many church leaders didn't see the feast as a threat to be crushed. They saw it as an energy that could be channeled into something positive. They guided it into these incredibly creative forms of worship. Masterpieces of religious art, like the beautiful play of Daniel, were written specifically for the Feast of Fools. This wasn't about trashing the church. It was about innovation within the service itself. Okay, so that brings us to a pretty big question, right? If the feast was often supported and even woven into church life, why do we have all these records condemning it? Why did it eventually get shut down? The feast wasn't just suppressed because people were suddenly behaving badly. It was taken down by a very deliberate, top-down political campaign that went on for decades. It really kicked off around 1400 with attacks from the powerful chancellor of the University of Paris. That led to a formal condemnation by a major church council, which was then made into law by the King of France. And that infamous 1445 letter we started with, that wasn't just a random description of events. It was basically the final nail in the coffin of a long, coordinated effort. But here's the twist in the story. Even after the original clerical feast was pretty much stamped out, the legend of the Feast of Fools just got bigger and bigger. And that's all thanks to a huge case of mistaken identity. So what happened is that historians, and later, famous writers like Victor Hugo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, they confused two completely different things. You had the original, the clerical Feast of Fools, run by junior clergy inside the church. But as that was being shut down, new secular festive societies run by regular townspeople started popping up. These groups held parades and put on satirical plays in the streets. The wild civic chaos people think of as the Feast of Fools often came from these later groups, not the original church service. This quote from a 19th century historian, Amai Sherist, really just nails it. The shocking stories, the black puddings on the altar, the smoke from old shoes, those were the exception, not the rule. They were isolated incidents blown way out of proportion by political campaign and then later stitched together by scholars to create this myth of constant, widespread mayhem. The story of the Feast of Fools is such a powerful reminder to always look a little closer at history's most exciting tales. It really forces you to ask, where do our stories about the past actually come from? And it makes you wonder, what other facts of history are just myths that we're too good not to believe?